The morning she walked away, the frost still clung to the windows like old regrets. She moved quietly, her slippers brushing against the creaky wooden floor of the house she'd called home for 35 years. The suitcase she packed was small, just enough for a few clothes, a tattered journal, and a photograph so faded, even the faces were ghosts. Her wedding ring, polished to a dull shine, sat cold and alone on the kitchen table. She didn't look back. Outside, the neighborhood slept. Curtains drawn, chimneys silent. Only old Mr. Kapoor, the widower next door, saw her. He was sipping his morning chai by the window, as he always did. His breath fogged the glass as he leaned closer, squinting. Where is she going with that suitcase? He wondered. She never left the house before sunrise. Never missed making breakfast for her husband. Never forgot to water the marigolds in the garden. But today, her steps were quick, her head low. The bus stop was a mile away, and she walked like someone afraid of being followed. By noon, the house was chaos. Her husband stormed from room to room, shouting questions at the walls. Why? How could she? The children arrived in a flurry of panic, her eldest son, gruff and red-faced, her daughter, clutching her own toddler tight, as if afraid the same vanishing might strike her, and the youngest, just 19, staring at the empty space where her slippers should have been. She wouldn't just leave, he kept saying, voice cracking. But the ring on the table said otherwise. Then, the letter. It was tucked under the sugar tin, a plain envelope with her shaky handwriting, for my youngest. The boy's hands trembled as he tore it open. The family crowded around, breath held. But all it said was, I'm sorry. One day, you'll understand. Don't look for me. The husband crumpled the note, cursing. The daughter wept. The youngest son slipped the paper into his pocket, its edges digging into his palm like a secret. That night, the neighborhood buzzed. Women whispered over fences. Men shook their heads. A mother doesn't leave, they said. Not like this. But Mr. Kapoor stayed silent. He'd seen the way she glanced over her shoulder at the bus stop, her eyes glinting with something he couldn't name, fear, or maybe relief. The bus's destination was painted in peeling letters on the windshield, a town he didn't recognize. A place far from here. As the family argued and wept, none noticed the photograph she'd left behind in her dresser drawer. A young man in a soldier's uniform, smiling beside a woman who looked just like her. Or the date scribbled on the back, 1965. By dawn, the youngest son was gone too. Years before she left, the woman had buried a secret, one that tied her to a promise she couldn't break. A faded photograph of a stranger, a locked drawer in her bedroom, and a midnight phone call would slowly unravel the truth. It began in a village where the air smelled of monsoon rains and ripe sugarcane. She was 17 then, her laughter echoing through fields of golden wheat. Her family, poor but proud, had arranged her marriage to a man from the city, a stranger with a stern face and a shop selling hardware. She pleaded with her father, tears staining her faded dupatta. What about him, she whispered, clutching the photograph of the young man in a soldier's uniform. The one who'd promised to return for her. Her father's silence was answer enough. The wedding day came. She wore red, her hands hennaed with patterns she didn't recognize. The soldier's photograph burned in her pocket like a secret. That night, her new husband snored beside her, and she stared at the ceiling, counting cracks until dawn. Years passed. Children came, 3 of them, and with each birth, a piece of her dreams slipped away. She hid the photograph in a drawer, locked with a tiny brass key. Her husband never asked about it. He was too busy tallying shop earnings or napping in his armchair. Some nights, she'd unlock the drawer, trace the soldier's smile, and wonder if he'd survived the war. If he'd ever thought of her. But it wasn't just the soldier she mourned. There were her parents, left behind in the village, growing frail and alone. Every month, she'd beg her husband for money to send them. "Your brother can care for them," he'd grunt, flipping through the newspaper. Her brother, though, had vanished years ago, angry, bitter, after their father sold her into marriage for a dowry he never received. Then, one midnight, the phone rang. Her husband cursed, rolling over in bed. She answered, her heart pounding. The voice on the line was cracked with age, but she knew it instantly. "Dee Dee, it's me." Her brother. For 30 years, not a word. Now, he was crying. "Come home. Before it's too late." The next morning, she found the letter. It had arrived weeks earlier, buried under grocery bills. Her brother's handwriting, shaky and urgent: "Father is gone. Mother won't last the month. She asks for you every day. Forgive me. Forgive us all." She crumpled to the floor, the words blurring. Downstairs, her husband shouted for his tea. The children argued over the radio. No one heard her sob. That afternoon, she did something reckless. She opened the locked drawer, shoved the letter and photograph into her purse, and boarded a bus to her village. The journey took hours, the roads bumpy and dust-choked. When she arrived, the house was a skeleton, roof caved in, walls eaten by termites. Her mother lay on a cot in the corner, skin like paper. "Beatty," the old woman's hand trembled. "You came." She bathed her mother, fed her rice gruel, and listened to stories she'd never heard. Stories of the soldier who'd come looking for her years ago. "He waited under the banyan tree for days," her mother whispered. "But your brother chased him away. Said you were happy in the city." Her heart split. That night, as her mother slept, she walked to the tree. Moonlight spilled through its branches, and for a moment, she was 17 again, hopeful, unbroken. Then she saw it, a name carved into the trunk. Hers. And beside it, a date, 1965. The soldier had kept his promise. She returned to the city the next day, her mother's final words ringing in her ears: "Live, Beatty. Before it's too late." But home was no longer home. Her husband scowled about her absence. The children barely glanced up from their plates. That night, she locked the drawer, but the key felt heavier now. 2 weeks later, another letter arrived. Her brother again. "Mother is gone. The funeral is tomorrow." She stared at the words, then at her family, laughing at a TV show. Quietly, she packed a suitcase. This time, she wouldn't return. The house felt hollow without her. Her husband paced the rooms like a ghost, muttering to himself. "She'll come back," he insisted, staring at the untouched roti on his plate. Women don't just leave. But the days turned to weeks, and the only thing that returned was the silence. The eldest daughter, now forced to take over her mother's chores, scrubbed the kitchen floor one afternoon. Her toddler played nearby, babbling to a torn rag doll. As she reached under the bed to sweep out dust, her fingers brushed against something hard, a small wooden box, hidden far beneath the frame. Inside lay a diary, its pages yellowed and brittle. The first entry was dated 1972. "Today, he called me pragmatic. I don't think he knows what it means. But he smiled when he said it, so I smiled too. The children are asleep. My hands still smell of onions." The daughter flipped through the pages, her throat tightening. "He brought roses today. Not for me. I found the receipt in his coat pocket. The shopgirl's name was written on it. I fed the roses to the cow. The youngest asked why I never sing. I couldn't tell him, my voice left with the soldier. I sent money to mother again. He doesn't know I sold my wedding chain. Let him yell." The postman said her hands shake too much to write back. The entries were fragments of a life half-lived, a woman folding herself smaller and smaller to fit into corners no one else saw. The daughter's hands trembled. How had they never noticed? Downstairs, her brother argued with their father. "You must have done something," he shouted. "Mothers don't abandon their families for no reason." The husband slammed his fist on the table. "I gave her everything. A home. Children. What else does a woman need?" The daughter stormed into the room, the diary clutched to her chest. "You gave her nothing." Her voice cracked like summer thunder. She read the entries aloud: the loneliness, the sold jewelry, the roses, the silent nights spent staring at the moon. The youngest son sank into a chair, his face pale. The husband's defiance crumbled. "And this," the daughter hissed, tossing a faded photo onto the table. "The soldier in uniform, young and hopeful. Who is he, Papa? Did you even care to ask?" The room froze. The husband's face flushed crimson. That's none of your business," he sputtered, but his eyes darted guiltily to the hallway. The eldest daughter followed his gaze. In the shadows, a woman stood, a neighbor, her sari draped hastily over her nightclothes. She'd come often these past months, offering help with the household. The daughter's stomach turned. The pieces fell into place: the late-night whispers, the borrowed sugar, the way her father's anger softened when this woman was near. "Get out," the daughter whispered. The neighbor fled. The youngest son stood abruptly, the soldier's photo in one hand, the diary in the other. "I'm going to find her." "Don't be a fool," his father roared. "She doesn't want us." But the boy was already at the door. He'd packed a bag, a map, the letter she'd left him, and the address scribbled on the back of the soldier's photo. A village in the mountains. The diary's final entry gnawed at him: "Last night, I dreamt of the banyan tree. He was there, waiting. When I woke, my pillow was wet. I think it's time to stop dreaming." As the boy stepped into the dusk, the eldest daughter pressed a wad of cash into his palm, money she'd saved for her child's birthday. "Bring her home," she said, though neither knew what home meant anymore. The husband watched from the window, his reflection a hollow man in glass. For the first time, he noticed her slippers still sitting by the door, dust gathering on the toes. The bus rattled through narrow mountain roads, its engine wheezing like an old man. The youngest son sat by the window, clutching his backpack. The soldier's photo pressed against his chest, tucked inside his shirt pocket. Outside, the world turned wilder, thick forests swallowing villages, cliffs dropping into rivers that roared like distant thunder. He'd never traveled this far alone. By dusk, the bus hissed to a stop in a village square. Goats wandered past stalls selling cracked clay pots and jaggery. The air smelled of pine resin and wood smoke. The boy stepped down, his shoes sinking into mud. A group of elderly men huddled around a fire, their faces carved deep with wrinkles. One eyed him sharply. "Looking for someone?" The boy hesitated, then held up the photograph. "This man. Do you know him?" The men fell silent. The fire crackled. Finally, the oldest one spoke, his voice gravelly. "That's Captain Saab. Died last week. His funeral is tomorrow." The boy's stomach lurched. "Died? And, the woman who came here?" "My mother." The men exchanged glances. "Ah," one muttered. "Her. She's at the old house. Up the hill." He pointed to a path swallowed by mist. "But you'd better hurry. The mountain eats secrets after dark." The boy climbed. The path twisted, stones slick with moss. His flashlight flickered, casting jagged shadows. Somewhere in the trees, an owl cried. He thought of his mother, how she'd walked this same path, carrying a suitcase and 40 years of silence. At the top of the hill, a house sagged under the weight of ivy. Its windows were shattered eyes. Light flickered inside. The boy's breath caught. There, in the doorway, stood his mother. But she was unrecognizable, her hair loose, her sari mud-stained, her eyes wide and frantic. She held a lantern high, its light trembling. "Ma," he whispered. She staggered back, as if he were a ghost. "No, no. You shouldn't be here." Before he could speak, she collapsed. He lunged forward, catching her. Her skin burned with fever. The lantern rolled, casting wild shadows across the walls. That's when he saw them, the photographs. Dozens, nailed to the rotting wood. His mother, young and laughing. The soldier, now old and frail, sitting in a wheelchair. A newspaper clipping, "War Hero Battles Cancer, Lives in Isolation." And letters. So many letters, tied with ribbon. His mother stirred, her voice a broken hum. I didn't know he was sick. Not until I came back." The boy's tears fell onto her forehead. "Why didn't you tell us?" She gripped his arm, her nails digging in. "They took everything from me. My father sold me. Your father ignored me. But she nodded to the soldier's photo. "He waited. Even when I didn't." Outside, the wind howled. The boy built a fire with cracked furniture, wrapped his mother in his jacket. She drifted in and out of sleep, murmuring fragments. "The banyan tree, he carved our names. I couldn't stay. I couldn't leave." At dawn, she woke lucid, her gaze steady. "You need to go," she said. "Not without you." She cupped his face, her hands rough and warm. "There's something I must do. For him. For me." She nodded to a rusted gate at the back of the house. Beyond it, a crumbling cemetery overlooked the valley. The boy followed her. They passed graves crowned with weeds until they reached a fresh mound of earth. No headstone, just a wooden plank, capped Rajesh Verma. Brave soldier. Loyal friend. His mother knelt, pressing her forehead to the soil. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I'm so sorry." The boy stood behind her, his shadow merging with hers in the rising sun. Down in the village, temple bells rang. A funeral procession began, men carrying a flower-strewn stretcher. The soldier's body, finally being laid to rest. His mother stood abruptly. "Go home. Tell your father, tell him I'm not coming back. Ma, please, go." Her voice cracked like ice. "Before I lose the courage to stay." He turned, tears blinding him, and stumbled down the hill. Halfway, he glanced back. She was still there, a small figure against the vast sky, her sari fluttering like a flag of surrender. That night, as the village mourned the soldier, the boy boarded the last bus home. In his pocket, he carried a letter he'd found in the old house, one his mother hadn't written. "To the woman I loved," it began. "If you read this, I'm already gone. But know this, my greatest battle was never the war. It was forgetting you." The funeral pyre smoked into the twilight, its embers swirling like fireflies. Villagers murmured prayers, their faces glowing in the orange light. She stood apart from them, her silhouette sharp against the dying flames. The soldier's nephew, a man with the same stubborn jawline, handed her a wooden box. "He wanted you to have this," he said. Inside were letters, every one she'd ever written him, tied with a ribbon the color of her youth. That night, she returned to the crumbling house. The wind whistled through broken windows, carrying the scent of ash and pine. She lit a candle and opened the first letter. "Dearest Rajesh, the mangoes are ripe here. I saved the sweetest one for you. Father says I must marry the shopkeeper next month. I don't think I can breathe anymore. Please come. Yours, always. She hadn't sent it. Couldn't risk her brother finding it. Instead, she'd buried it in a tin beneath the banyan tree. The soldier, it seemed, had dug it up years later. A cough echoed from the corner. She turned, startled. An old man sat in a wheelchair, blankets piled on his lap. His face was gaunt, eyes sunken, but his voice was soft velvet. "You kept your promise," he said. She froze. "Rajesh." He smiled, a ghost of the boy she'd loved. "You came back." The room spun. She gripped the table. "You're alive?" "But they said, the funeral." "My nephew thought it would be kinder to let you believe I was gone. The cancer, it's in its final act." He gestured to a morphine drip beside him. "But I wanted to see you one last time. Even if it's just a shadow of me." She fell to her knees beside him, her hands hovering over his skeletal fingers. "I'm sorry. For everything." He chuckled, a dry rasp. "You think I didn't know? Your brother came to my camp in '65. Told me you'd married a rich man, that you'd forgotten me." His eyes gleamed. "But I knew your heart. Even when mine broke." They talked through the night. He spoke of the war, the shrapnel in his leg, the village children who brought him figs. She told him of her children, the diary, the husband who'd never seen her. When the morphine fog lifted, he whispered, "Why now? After all these years?" She opened the box of letters. "Because I finally stopped being afraid." The banyan tree stretched its arms over the river. She'd stolen away at dawn, her bare feet sinking into dew-soaked grass. Rajesh waited, his uniform crisp, his smile brighter than the rising sun. He dropped to one knee, not for honor, but for love. "Run away with me," he pleaded. "Tonight. We'll take the train to Bombay." She kissed him, a first, desperate kiss, then pulled away. "My parents, they'll die of shame." "Then let's die together," he said, pressing a folded train ticket into her hand. "Meet me at the station. 8 p.m. She never came. That night, her brother found the ticket, tore it to pieces, and locked her in the grain shed. Through a crack in the wood, she watched the stars fade, one by one. The soldier's breath grew shallow as dawn approached. She fed him sips of water, her hands steady now. "Do you regret it?" he asked. "Staying?" She thought of her children, her daughter's first steps, her youngest son's laughter, the way they'd clung to her sorry during thunderstorms. "No," she lied. "But I regret not fighting harder for myself." He nodded, eyes closing. "Stay until the end?" "Always." As the sun rose, his grip on her hand loosened. The morphine monitor flatlined. She didn't call for help. Instead, she sang, a lullaby she'd hummed to her children, her voice cracking like ancient wood. Outside, the village began to stir. A cowbell clanged. A child laughed. In his final moments, Rajesh opened his eyes. You're still the girl under the banyan tree," he whispered. Then he was gone. She sat there for hours, his hand growing cold in hers. When the nephew came, he found her staring at the soldier's uniform hanging on the wall, the same one from the photograph. "He wore that every Sunday," the nephew said. "Said it made him feel close to you." She didn't weep. Didn't speak. Just reached into her blouse and pulled out the rusty tin she'd buried decades ago. Inside were wilted mango leaves, a broken bangle, and the train ticket fragments Rajesh had kept all these years. "Burn these with him," she said. "Let them travel together this time." The youngest son returned home to a silent house. No one greeted him. His father's armchair sat empty, a half-drunk cup of tea gone cold on the side table. The eldest daughter emerged from the kitchen, her eyes red-rimmed and sharp. "Where is he?" the boy asked. Hospital, she snapped. Heart attack. 3 days ago. The words hit him like a slap. He'd been gone a week, no calls, no messages. In his backpack, the soldier's letter felt like a brick. Is he alive? Barely. She shoved a bag of clothes into his arms. Go. He keeps asking for you. The hospital hallway smelled of antiseptic and dread. His father lay in a bed by the window, tubes snaking from his arms. The once stern man now looked shrunken, his skin gray. When he saw his son, he tried to sit up, then winced. Did you find her? The boy hesitated. Yes, and she chose a dying man over you. Instead, he said, she's safe. His father's face crumpled. Tell her. I'm sorry. About the shopgirl. The roses. All of it. The admission hung in the air, sour and heavy. The boy's fists clenched. You're sorry now, asterisk. Now that she's gone, asterisk, but before he could speak, the heart monitor spiked. Nurses rushed in, pushing him out. At home, his sister waited like a storm cloud. What did he say? He apologized. She laughed bitterly. Too late. On the table lay the unopened letter their mother had left months ago, the one addressed to the youngest. The sister stabbed a finger at it. Read it. Maybe it'll explain why she ruined us. The boy tore the envelope. His mother's handwriting, steady and gentle. My dearest, if you're reading this, I've failed you twice, first by staying, then by leaving. But some truths are too heavy to carry silently. Your father wasn't the only one who broke promises. I did too. I let myself vanish, day by day, until there was nothing left to love. Don't make my mistakes. Forgive me. Ma, his sister snatched the letter, read it, then tossed it into the fireplace. She's the victim now? Typical. The boy watched the paper curl into ash. Outside, thunder growled. A storm brewed on the horizon, the same one lashing the mountains where his mother sat in a crumbling house. Rajesh's letters clutched to her chest. As rain battered the city, the phone rang. The boy answered. A voice crackled through static, a village elder. Tell her, the roads are flooded. The bridge is gone. If she doesn't leave now, she'll be trapped here for weeks. The boy froze. Put her on. A pause. Then his mother's voice, thin but calm. Beta? Ma, come home. Please. There's a storm, I know. Her words dissolved into a cough. The doctor here says Rajesh's nephew has a truck. He can take me to the next town. But what? Silence. Then a whisper, what if I don't want to leave? The line went dead. Rain lashed the mountainside, turning the village into a river of mud. The old house groaned under the storm's fury, its walls shuddering. She huddled by the fireplace, Rajesh's letters spread around her like fallen leaves. The nephew had left an hour ago, shouting over the wind, the truck won't wait. If we don't go now, we're stuck here for weeks. She stared at the soldier's uniform hanging on the wall. Stay, it seemed to whisper. Stay where someone finally saw you. But then the phone rang. It was her daughter, voice frayed with tears. Papa's worse. The doctors say he might not last the night. He's asking for you. The fire crackled. A log split, sending sparks spiraling. I can't, she said softly. Can't? Her daughter's rage crackled through the line. He's dying, Ma. Do you hate us that much? She closed her eyes. Memories collided, her husband's laughter when their youngest took his first steps, the way he'd sneaked sweets into her purse during temple visits. And Rajesh's voice, frail but fierce, live, Beti. before it's too late. The nephew burst in, drenched and panting. The bridge is collapsing. We have minutes. Ma, please, her daughter begged. Silence stretched, thin and sharp. Then, a sound she hadn't made in decades, a wail, raw and guttural. It clawed its way out of her throat, shaking her bones. The nephew froze. Even the storm seemed to pause. Tell your father, she swallowed ash. Tell him I loved him. Once. The line went dead. The city was drowning. Monsoon rains flooded the streets, their shop knee-deep in water. Her husband stacked sandbags, cursing. She balanced their youngest on her hip, ladling rice onto plates. Lightning flashed. The toddler burst into tears. Her husband dropped the sandbags, soaked and shivering, and pulled them both into his arms. We'll be okay, he murmured, his breath warm on her neck. For a moment, she believed him. The nephew dragged her to the truck. She clutched Rajesh's letters to her chest, the ink bleeding in the rain. As the engine roared to life, she glanced back at the crumbling house. The soldier's uniform swayed in the broken window, a spectral farewell. The truck skidded down the mountain, wheels sliding on mud. Behind them, the bridge snapped like a twig, crashing into the ravine. The nephew white-knuckled the steering wheel. Cutting it close, Auntie. She didn't reply. Her fingers traced the train ticket fragments in her pocket, the ones Rajesh had kept. Bombay. 8 p.m. 1965. At the nearest town, she stumbled into a phone booth. The hospital's front desk answered. ICU, please. A nurse's voice, he's critical. Family only. I'm his wife. A pause. He's been asking for you. Hold on. Her husband's breath rattled through the receiver. You came back? She leaned her forehead against the glass. No, wet cough. Good. You deserved better. The line hummed. Somewhere, a machine beeped steadily. Then, silence. The nephew touched her shoulder. Auntie? We have to keep moving. She hung up, her reflection fractured in the rain-streaked glass. Some choices leave you no self to return to. The youngest son sprinted down the hospital corridor, his sister's sobs echoing behind him. Too late. The bed was empty, sheets stripped. A nurse folded his father's clothes into a plastic bag. He passed 5 minutes ago. Last words were for your mother. The boy sank to the floor. In his pocket, the soldier's letter burned. My greatest battle was never the war. It was forgetting you. Next morning the storm had washed the world clean. She stood at the edge of the town's bus station, a ticket to nowhere in her hand. The nephew had offered to drive her home. She'd refused. As the bus pulled in, a familiar voice shouted, Ma. Her youngest son ran toward her, clothes muddy, face streaked with tears. He collapsed into her arms. He's gone, Ma. Papa's gone. She held him, her chin resting on his head. The bus honked, impatient. Come home, he whispered. She looked past him, at the road snaking through the mountains. Rajesh's voice, her husband's laugh, her children's cries, all spun together in the wind. I don't know where home is, she said. But she took her son's hand anyway. The house smelled of incense and grief. Neighbors had draped the doorway with marigolds, their sweetness clashing with the stifling silence inside. The eldest daughter sat rigid on the sofa, her toddler asleep in her lap. When her mother walked in, she didn't look up. You missed the funeral, she said flatly. The mother placed a hand on her husband's armchair, its fabric worn thin by decades of neglect. I know. The youngest son stepped forward, holding the unopened letter, the one she'd left months ago, its edges frayed. We need to talk. The eldest daughter scoffed. What's left to say? You abandoned us. He died alone. Now you're back to play the martyr. The mother reached into her sari's folds and pulled out a bundle, Rajesh's letters, tied with the faded ribbon. I didn't come back for forgiveness. I came to give you the truth. The youngest son tore the envelope, his voice trembling as he read aloud, My dearest, if you're reading this, I've failed you twice, first by staying silent, then by leaving loudly. Your father wasn't a villain. He was a man who forgot how to see me. And I was a woman who forgot how to be seen. When I found Rajesh's letters, I realized I'd buried myself alive. But leaving wasn't about choosing him over you. It was about choosing to breathe again. Forgive me. Ma, the eldest daughter snatched the letter, her eyes scanning the words. So this is your excuse? Breathing? The mother knelt before her, placing the soldier's letters on the floor. Read them. Reluctantly, the daughter picked one. Rajesh's handwriting, bold and urgent, Dearest, they told me you were happy. I didn't believe it. Happiness doesn't silence eyes like yours. I'll wait. Even if it takes lifetimes. The daughter's defiance faltered. The mother crossed to her old room, the family trailing behind. From under the bed, she dragged out a rusted tin box. Inside were dried mango leaves, a child's milk tooth, and a stack of rupee notes, yellowed, dated 1975. Your school fees, she said to the eldest daughter. I sold my wedding jewelry. Your father never knew. The daughter stiffened. You think money fixes this? No. But it explains why I stayed. The mother lifted a crumpled photo, her husband holding their newborn son, grinning like a boy. He wasn't always distant. We weren't always strangers. The eldest daughter's jaw tightened. And the shopgirl? The roses? The mother sighed. I knew. But anger is a luxury when you're fighting to survive. She opened Rajesh's final letter, dated a week before his death. Don't mourn me. Mourn the years you spent shrinking. Go home. Make them hear you. The youngest son wiped his eyes. Why didn't you tell us? Would you have listened? She turned to her daughter. When was the last time you asked about my day? My dreams? Even my favorite color? The room stilled. The daughter glanced at her sleeping child, her voice small. What is your favorite color? Yellow. Like sunflowers. That night, they gathered in the garden. The mother lit a diya, its flame trembling in the breeze. We'll mourn your father tomorrow. But tonight, we mourn what we lost long ago. She handed each child a letter, one she'd written but never sent. To the eldest, you have your father's fire. Don't let it burn you. To the youngest, your laughter was my compass. Keep it loud. The daughter stared at hers, tears smudging the ink. I watched you become a mother. You were glorious. I'm sorry I never said it. As the household slept, the mother slipped into her husband's study. In his desk drawer, she found what she dreaded, a stack of unsent letters addressed to her. I saw you crying last night. I didn't know how to fix it. So I bought roses. But they felt like lies. 1982, the shopgirl meant nothing. You'd stopped looking at me. 1995, I'm sorry. For all of it. Undated, she sank to the floor, clutching the pages. Outside, the youngest son watched, his heart breaking for the love that had arrived too late. The morning of the funeral dawned crisp and golden, the sky streaked with hues of saffron and rose. The family gathered not at a grave, but beneath the old banyan tree in their garden, its gnarled roots now cradling two urns, one for the father, another for the soldier. The mother stood between them, her yellow sari bright as a sunflower. We bury the dead, she said, but we must also bury the lies that keep us strangers. The eldest daughter stepped forward, clutching her father's final letter. Her voice wavered as she read aloud, "To my wife, last night, I dreamt of the monsoon when our son was born. You laughed as the rain soaked us, and for a moment, I saw the girl I'd married. I'm sorry I stopped looking. Yours, in regret." The youngest son placed Rajesh's rusted tin box beside the urns. Inside were the mango leaves, the train ticket fragments, and a new addition, a sapling from the banyan tree in Rajesh's village. "To grow where we let go," he whispered. The mother knelt, her hands pressing into the soil. Love isn't about staying or leaving. It's about seeing each other before it's too late. She sprinkled marigold petals over the urns, their orange blending with the earth. The eldest daughter hesitated, then touched her mother's shoulder. "Ma, will you stay?" The mother stood, wiping dirt from her hands. "No. But I'll visit. And this time, I'll tell you stories, not just of duty, but of the girl who loved sunflowers and sang off-key." The daughter nodded, tears glinting. "I'd like that." As the sun climbed, the family planted the sapling together, its tender roots nestled between the urns. The mother handed her children seeds, sunflower seeds. "Water them with honesty," she said. "They'll grow even in cracked soil." Later, as the youngest son walked her to the bus stop, he asked, "Where will you go?" She smiled, adjusting the scarf he'd draped over her shoulders. "Wherever the road listens." At the station, she hugged him tightly. "Don't let silence be your inheritance, Beta. Speak. Even if your voice shakes." He watched her board the bus, her yellow sari a flicker of light against the dusty seats. As it pulled away, he whispered, "Goodbye, Ma." Epilogue: 1 year later, the banyan sapling now reached their knees, its leaves whispering secrets to the sunflowers swaying beside it. The eldest daughter sat beneath it, her toddler chasing butterflies. The youngest son visited weekly, letters from his mother pinned to a corkboard in the kitchen, postcards from hill stations, seaside towns, and finally, a photo of her volunteering at a school, children clinging to her sari. On the anniversary of the funeral, a package arrived. Inside was Rajesh's old uniform, neatly folded, and a note, "Love is not a cage. It's the wind beneath your wings." Ma, the son hung the uniform beside their father's photo. Two men who'd loved her, flawed, human, but part of the same story. That evening, as the family shared chai under the banyan tree, the eldest daughter laughed, a sound long absent. Her child mimicked her, clapping sticky hands. The youngest son pulled a letter from his pocket, addressed to a girl he'd been too shy to speak to. The lesson was simple, yet unyielding: to love is to listen. To live is to let go.